Let's start. Good morning, everyone. Welcome you to this new webinar with the presentation by Benjamin Golub, who is currently affiliated with Harvard University, and he's going to be talking about financial networks and contagion. Let me first read Benjamin's bio. His research focuses on microtheory and, in particular, social and economic networks. He studies how these networks form when agents invest strategically in relationships and how information is transmitted through them and how they mediate important economic processes such as group cooperation. So, for example, he has a paper on ranking agendas for negotiations that could lead to some hints on how countries should set bilateral negotiations. Some other applications of the research include measuring social segregation and understanding its consequence for polarization of beliefs or behaviors. His current work focuses on a theory of groups negotiation, for example, over pollutions in setting where players' efforts will have asymmetric effects on each other's payoffs. And he also works on experimental studies on how social networks lead to a contagion of incorrect beliefs or behaviors due to biases in the way individuals process and transmit information. Golub is currently a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows until June of next year, when he will start an appointment as an assistant professor at the Department of Economics. He received his PhD in economics at Stanford, and he also holds a BS in mathematics from the California Institute of Technology. So without further ado, let me introduce Benjamin Golub. Thank you very much, Benjamin. And if anyone has a question, please feel free to write a question in the chat window or raise your hand, and we'll be happy to open your mic so that you can ask the question directly.
Okay, so thank you very, very much for the opportunity to present in the seminar. We're very excited to present this work and get feedback from people involved in policymaking, because a lot of our concerns throughout this project were to think about networks in a way that would be useful to people who actually have to deal with financial networks, who have access to data. And so this is a particularly exciting forum. So this project is joined with Matt Elliott, who's at Caltech, and Matt Jackson at Stanford. So the starting point of this project is that the possibility of the contagion of financial distress makes it critical to understand the network structure. Sorry, I'm gonna try to get a little, or turn up my microphone volume just a moment. Okay, good. So the possibility of financial contagion makes it critical to understand the network structure of the interdependencies among organizations, and both the direct and indirect connections that exist among various organizations. So we need tools to help us evaluate contagion risk, both tools that you can do simulations with, that people at central banks can use to run policy simulations, but also conceptual tools to help us think about what is important about the networks, which features of networks should we focus on, because networks are so complicated that we need some discipline in order to avoid, having a total blow up of the complexity. And so this project aims to think about both those things, both conceptual and computational aspects of financial contagion. And I should note from the outset that large cascades of financial distress are off the equilibrium path, and that's a good thing. That's because of the reactions of both individual firms in the economy as well as policymakers. Nevertheless, we think it's really important to understand how those cascades look in order to inform the decisions of policymakers. Even if we can manage to keep them off path, their structure matters a lot for policy in reality. So what we do in this paper is we develop a simple model of cascades in a network of financial cross-holdings. And in this model, we make a distinction between two aspects of a network. One is diversification, which refers to how many counterparties a typical organization has. And the other is integration, which refers to how big those relationships between counterparties are. So one is the first one, diversification, is an extensive margin, and integration is an intensive margin. Once we have that model, we're going to highlight some non-monotonicities. Both of these things, diversification and integration, are going to have non-monotonic effects on the extent of contagion. And finally, if there's time, we'll present a very, very simple illustration of how the model can be used empirically, applied to numbers that we got from the Bank of International Settlements. And our goal in doing this is sort of to suggest how policymakers with much better data than we have, who have regulatory reports on particular cross-holdings, can use that to do the kind of contagion analyses we present. So there's a big literature, and this slide is intended to suggest that we don't have a comprehensive review of it, but papers starting with this cloud, Rocher and Tirole and Allen and Gale. How is is the sound okay? I just want to make sure that that it's audible.
Yeah, in general, I think we can hear you well, but if you get a little bit closer to the mic, because some people have told me that they hear a little bit of echo.
Okay, got it. I'm gonna try to get closer, and if it's still bad, I can switch to a different microphone. So up in this cloud here, we have a literature that started with Rocher and Tirole and Allen and Gale and Kiyotaki and Moore, who just pointed out that indirect propagation of distress and cascades can be important and can lead to new phenomena. And then there was a literature that's in applied mathematics and computer science that developed the first network approaches to these ideas. And then recently, there's a whole bunch of papers which we've found very useful as we've progressed on this work, by Cabrales and Gottardi and Vega Redondo, by Asimoglu and co-authors, a bunch of papers that explore the network, that sort of combine these two approaches and take them to sort of a fully modern network treatment of financial cascades. So these are some of the most important papers. Eisenberg and Noe is very important, and I'm happy to discuss connections with any of them in detail. So now, without further ado, let me get into the model, and then present the basic setup, which will be based on a kind of Leontief model of financial relationships. So the basic units in this model are organizations. We left it intentionally abstract. You can think of these as either countries in an international model, or banks or firms, and they have claims on two kinds of things. One kind of thing is a fundamental asset, something that produces value in the economy, like a project. And they can also have cross-claims on each other. So this is the model without any notation. So the key thing we're going to introduce, the key novelty, is that when an organization's value falls below a critical level, the value of others' claims on it is going to drop in a discontinuous way. And that will lead to possible propagation of those discontinuous inefficiencies. So a very concrete example is when Greece was going through its distress in the recent European crisis, civil unrest at some point broke out. That disrupted the political climate, it disrupted production, and that led to a discrete reduction in the value of future Greek tax receipts and Greece's ability to pay its debt. So that's the kind of event. It's a real physical illiquidity or inefficiency that's going to then propagate through the network. And we focus on those kinds of discontinuous drops. And the key thing is that then given the network, a drop in value of one organization can lead to the drop of value in others, and that can propagate through the network. So that's the bird's eye informal setting. With a little bit of symbols, here's how we're going to capture those things. We're going to have organizations. Those are labeled 1 through n, and the assets are 1 through m. And the price or the net present value of asset K, think of this as a project that generates a net flow of cash. The value of that is PK. Okay, so that's the notation for the fundamental value generating things in the economy. And DIK is the fraction of the kth project or kth asset that's directly owned in a way that I'll make precise, directly owned by organization I. So D is the matrix of direct holdings. That's the direct holdings. Now let's talk about the cross holdings. There is a fraction Cij of organization J that's held by organization I. And as an accounting matter, we set that CII is 0, so you don't own yourself. And instead, we say that the part of an organization that's not owned by any of its counterparties is owned privately. So it accrues to some external private investors that are outside of the system, that are not held by anyone else themselves. And those of you who are familiar with models of equity cross-holdings will recognize this structure as the standard one. So let me now give some meaning to these statements about ownership, who owns what. The way we're going to compute the total value of all the shares in an organization, which is called capital VI, is as follows. By the way, we call this sometimes the book value of an organization because it sort of just adds up all its everything it owns in a fairly simple way. We're going to say that that's equal to the sum of two terms. One is the direct asset holdings. So these are the assets that this organization directly owns. We incorporate a share DIK of the kth asset value, right? So these are the things that you have direct claims on. And then we're going to add to that the value of your cross claims. So if you have a share CIJ in organization J, then we're going to add a fraction Cij of its value, computed according to this same equation, to your value. So this is a fixed point definition of the value of all shares that takes into account the fact that your value also depends on the value of other firms or other organizations. And please, I would really be happy if people stopped me and got clarification on the basics, because they're going to be very important. So let me just do a very simple example. Let's say we have two organizations so that each of them owns 1/2 of the other. And then what we're going to have is the following matrices of cross-holdings. So this matrix C captures that you own 1/2 of the other guy and he owns 1/2 of you, okay? Which leaves the remaining half of the value to flow to your outside or private investors. So here's the same situation depicted in the picture. Let's imagine, so I'll come back and do more illustration, but the basic idea is the arrows here are directed the way that the money goes. So this should be an arrow from organization 1 to organization 2, okay? So money flows in that direction, and money also flows in the opposite direction. And these coefficients tell you what fraction, okay? So we'll come back and illustrate that some more. But let's go back to the value equations and use this to work out the values, the steady state values of organizations in this world. So here I took the value equations that you've already seen, and I am going to write the value of this value vector now, just in vector notation. So D is now a matrix, and everything else is a vector. So D and C are matrices, and P and V are vectors. So this is just a vector version of this first equation. And using simple linear algebra, we can invert this system and solve for the vector of values as a function of just the exogenous stuff, which is this P, which is, remember, the net present values of the fundamental assets. Okay, so that's the, okay. So this is the Leontief. Those of you who are familiar with Leontief type models will recognize that this is a Leontief type way to distribute the value of the fundamental assets. And this matrix, this is the Leontief inverse that's familiar from any kind of traditional intersectoral model. Now, there's a certain piece of bookkeeping to be careful about in thinking about the value of an organization. We wrote it in this way. We computed the value of all shares, and there's a certain kind of double counting that can happen here. So the key thing is that the assets of organization I are counted in its own value, but then they're also counted in the value of other organizations that cross-hold it. And so if we add up all these capital V's, we're going to get a larger amount of value than is actually in the fundamental assets. So we're double counting some assets in this value computation. That may or may not be a big deal depending on what you care about, but some people prefer to have a measure of value that's not susceptible to this inflation problem, this blowing up problem. And so one thing you could do instead is keep track of what we call the little vi, which are the values that ultimately accrue to the outside investors. Remember, C hat II is what's owned by the outside private shareholders of organization I. And so if we keep track of only the part of the value that they get to keep, that is conserved. There's no inflation there. There's no blow up. And we call those things the market values. So we can rewrite them using our solution up here. We can rewrite these ultimate values accruing to the private holders of each organization as this vector little v. And in the end, it basically is just equal to some matrix A times each organization's direct asset holdings. DP says what is each organization owning as its direct asset value. So these AIJs are capturing the fraction of the returns that are directly owned by J that ultimately accrue to the private shareholders of I. You can think of it basically, so if I is France and J is Greece, then AIJ is the fraction of the Greek fiscal stream that's ultimately owed to somebody in France, right? And so this matrix, which has columns adding up to 1 because all the value has to go somewhere, describes the distribution of returns throughout the whole economy. And this is familiar from standard models of cross-holdings going back to a finance literature in the late 80s and early 90s. There's papers that we cite in our paper that also discuss this in much more detail. Okay, so let's do an example. Let's suppose that we have these two organizations. There's an arrow going this way, so let me draw in the arrows that are missing. There's an arrow like this and an arrow like this. Okay, and let's imagine that $1 lands on organization 1. So one new dollar lands from the project that's owned by organization 1. And what can we say about what happens to it? Well, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to send 50 cents of that to organization 2, and the remaining 50 cents is going to go out to its private shareholders. And then as soon as that happens, it's as if organization 2 has received 50 cents of new income, so it's going to distribute a half of that, which is 25 cents, to its own private shareholders and return the remaining 25 cents to organization 1. And that's going to keep happening. So in the end, we're going to keep sending the income back and forth this way, and this will result in a sum of values to each of the private shareholders, right? So we're keep doing this. Every time half goes to the other organization and half gets delivered to the outside shareholders. And ultimately, once we add everything up, we're going to find that of this $1 that fell on organization 1, 2/3 of it accrued to the private shareholders of organization 1, and the remaining 1/3 went out to the private shareholders of organization 2. So those are the entries of the A matrix. We see that organization 1 ultimately delivers 2/3 of its private investments to its own shareholders and 1/3 to the shareholders of organization 2, and vice versa. So this tells you what this A matrix, these matrix calculations we did in the previous slide are. That this is a concrete example of what those numbers mean. So Alberto asks a question. Why is this the scheme for the distribution of value, this $1? Maybe something else could have happened to it. It's basically by assumption. We assume that all value that is delivered to organization 1 is shared out according to these linear rationing rules. And that is a serious assumption. You can imagine other rationing schemes where maybe in a certain regime, the first dollar would always be delivered to equity, and dollars, to debt, and later dollars would go to equity. So this is the simplest kind of linear cross holdings, which is particularly tractable and natural, and we think relevant in a bunch of settings. But there's nothing, it's an assumption that value is rationed in this linear way. And I'll get into some connections to how we think this models debt in a few slides. So here's the key. So far I've presented basically a standard cross holdings model. And here's where our model becomes different from the standard. We're going to assume that if an organization's value drops below some threshold that we call underlying VI, its value falls by some number, beta I, which you can think of as a failure or bankruptcy cost. Okay, so we're then going to define the vector B to be the realized bankruptcy costs. So organizations are losing these failure costs if they're in fact below their thresholds, and they're not otherwise. And this B captures that situation. And then we can rewrite the value equation that we have already met by saying that the values of organizations are exactly as they were before, except now we take out of each organization's balance sheet the failure costs it's had to sustain. So you should think of these failure costs as some real disruption in operations. For example, an airline can no longer afford to pay for its gas because it can't get financing anymore, and so its airplanes have to sit idle. So in that case, this BV actually captures the lost revenue that it's not getting because it can't fly its airplanes. And so these bankruptcy costs are going to also be distributed according to this A matrix, which captures the interdependencies between organizations. And let me demonstrate in a picture what our model focuses on. So in a standard model of debt, this is a picture everybody will recognize. If you have I owning debt in J, then as the value of J varies, you're going to have this kind of transition from being able to pay your debt holder everything you owe him to a regime in which your debt holder is rationed and he doesn't get the full value that you owe him. Now, this rationing often happens in a very orderly way. Basically, there are write-downs. People sort of take, they take losses on their values, but no physical disruption needs to happen. What we consider is a more general function where at some point you can actually have a discontinuous loss. So at some point, after enough of this rationing has happened, either there's a lawsuit or a political renegotiation or some kind of event that leads value to be discontinuously lost, and now there's a reduced amount of value to be shared around. And this is the regime of disorderly default. What we focus on in the equations that I showed you is this circled regime where, first of all, we ignore the safe part of the debt curve where everybody can pay their debts. If there are organizations like that, they don't do anything interesting in a model like this. They're just paying, you can count on them to pay what they owe. And we're focusing on this regime where there's rationing happening. So organizations' values actually depend on other organizations' values. And moreover, there's a chance of falling off these cliffs, these discontinuities. And at that point, real value is lost. So this is, if a lot of finance people are curious, how does this linear model you wrote down relate to a more realistic notion of debt? And this is our picture to show how we think about that we focus in on a distressed debt situation, which is what's happening in this circle, with discontinuities that can happen due to liquidation or inefficiency. And again, please jump in if there are questions about the particulars of that story. Okay. So I'm going to come back and address questions as they come up, but let me move on and talk about how we compute fixed points, consistent values in this model. This is the equation we have. So the value of an organization depends on the values of others in a way that includes these bankruptcy costs. And this is, even though it's a complicated equation, it's no longer linear in V, the way that the system is without failures. It's actually possible to say a lot about it. So these equilibria form a complete lattice, which means that they're very nicely ordered in terms of failures across. For any two equilibria, there's an equilibrium that's sort of the max and the min. And that allows us to focus on a unique best case equilibrium, which has the fewest number of failures and the highest value that is sustainable in this model. And the way to compute this equilibrium set of values is as follows. You look at so what's exogenous here, remember, the exogenous thing is the P. That's what nature tells you. So given that exogenous values have been realized, the first thing you do is you compute these values assuming that nobody has to pay any bankruptcy costs, any failure costs. And it's possible that even so, some organizations will be below their thresholds for failing, for incurring this cost. In that case, you have to make them fail, so you update this B vector to take out their failure costs. And then you compute this again, now with that new value of BV. It's possible that at that point everybody can survive, and in that case you're done. But if not, you also fail the organizations that have to fail given the first set of failures, and you keep doing that, then you recompute again, and the first time that everybody is above their thresholds, who's left, who hasn't failed yet, you're done. You found the best case equilibrium. These are the highest values that can be sustained in any equilibrium. Okay, so that's not meant to be completely obvious, but we discussed the details in the paper. And the takeaway from this slide is that there is a simple, computationally simple way to figure out the best equilibrium values, the best consistent values that can be sustained in this model. And we're going to focus for most of the paper on the best case equilibrium. In practical terms, that basically means that we don't allow pure coordination bank runs. We don't consider cases in which an organization is failing simply because it's expected that its counterparties do not trust its ability to survive, and vice versa, it doesn't trust its counterparties. So even though everybody could have survived, this sort of bad coordination of beliefs makes everyone fail. That's not a best case equilibrium. It's possible to use basically the same techniques we study in this paper to study the worst case equilibrium or other equilibria, and we focus on the best case for concreteness, and also so that when we say, there are a lot of failures, we really mean in every equilibrium there are a lot of failures. But you could do the same kind of equilibrium finding technique to find other kinds of equilibria in this lattice. Good. So there's a question about how we think of, I have been a little bit sloppy in using the word bankruptcy on the one hand and using the word failure or liquidation. So let me go back to the picture to address Abraham's question. You can think of this regime as sort of bankruptcy proceedings, or even better, some kind of arbitration that basically, here in this regime, the assets are not valuable enough to pay everybody what they're owed. That's bad. But maybe they can deal with it, as Abraham says, in some kind of orderly way. And so basically here, everybody's getting rationed, paid a fraction of what they're owed, but nothing inefficient is happening. At some point, there is a disorderly liquidation, or at least there may be, and that's when this discontinuity is sustained. So actually, I should be precise. We're definitely not equating bankruptcy liquidation with the inefficiency. It may be that projects can be rationed or liquidated efficiently, which is this part of the curve. But then it may be that at some point, if you have to go to court and it takes a long time, there are real resources lost, and that's this part, and that's where the real discontinuity, the real economic losses kick in. And so we think a big part of what we realized in this project is that we shouldn't think of those things as the same. They're different, and when we're modeling processes like this, we should be careful not to identify the beginning of the rationing process with actual value loss. So let me now go forward. So that's the setup. It took a little while. Thank you for your patience. But now we're going to jump in and actually talk about cascades and how losses of value propagate in this model. So let me give a very bird's eye view of how we can think of a contagion. There are three things that need to happen in order for a big cascade to happen, a macroeconomically significant cascade, if you want. First, there needs to be a first failure. So some organization must suffer a big enough loss that it actually incurs this cost. Okay? Then the second ingredient is local contagion. It has to be that organization is sufficiently connected in the economy that it causes some counterparties enough distress so that they fail as well. And finally, the last step is there needs to be wider propagation so that not only does this hurt the first organization and its counterparties, but there's enough interconnection in the economy that initial distress spreads to a large number of other organizations. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at these cascades through the lens of these three ingredients, and even though these ingredients are quite loose, thinking about them is going to help us understand what causes the cascades and what are some of the trade-offs that network structure leads to. So remember, there are going to be two ingredients that I haven't defined formally yet that are going to be our main independent variables, the things that we're going to vary. One is diversification, which is how many counterparties does a typical organization have. And the other ingredient is integration, which is how big a share of a typical organization is cross-held by its counterparties. And we're going to explore how both of these things affect cascades, both by looking at formal results using random graph theory in large markets, and then we're going to develop some simulations that are going to give us more intuition for those results. And actually, I'll show you these things I guess we'll do the theory first, and then, I'll do this in the other order because I think it's more intuitive to do the simulation exercise first and then show that it can be supported by rigorous theory. So here's how the basic simulation setup works. There is one proprietary one proprietary asset per organization, which you can think of as just your investments, your fiscal stream. This is just to make things very simple. And each of them starts at the same value. So there's no a priori asymmetry in that sense. And the values are going to be determined by the cross-holdings matrix. Okay, now what is the network going to look like? Here's the how the network is set up. We're going to let each organization have a financial relationship with each other organization, and the probability that two organizations are linked this way is equal to this number. And what that's designed to do is to make it so that each organization has in expectation D counterparties. So D here is the level of diversification. Okay. Now, given that network structure of who owns whom, we're going to have a fraction C of an organization evenly divided among those who hold it. Okay, so the way this works is we're going to let the cross holdings that organization I has in organization J be equal to, well, nothing. So if this G is 0, if those two don't have a relationship, then there is no cross holdings. If they do have a relationship, then everybody who owns organization J according to this graph will have an equal share of it, and the total amount that outsiders own in a given organization will add up to little c. Okay, so that gives us this cross-holdings matrix, and then there will be c hat, which is the remaining value that accrues to the private shareholders of each organization. And then we're going to, given this network structure, okay, we're going to pick one asset and devalue it to 0. We're going to destroy all the value of one organization. You can think of that as the exogenous shock, okay? And then we're going to say this failure threshold is you have to lose a certain fraction of your value, okay? And that's what the condition is for failing, for incurring the failure costs. And the bankruptcy or failure here means once you hit that threshold, you lose all your remaining value. So your value goes to 0 as well. And we're going to look, given this setup, we're going to look at the resulting cascade, how big it is, how many organizations fail. So let me show you the basic structure of how these cascades look. What we're doing in this graph is on the x-axis, we're varying the expected degree, that number little d, which is describing how many organizations a typical organization has a relationship with. And then on the y-axis, we're going to be plotting the number or the fraction of organizations that fail in the resulting cascade. And what you see here, the important thing about this picture, is that for low diversification, there's no failures. And for very high diversification, there's basically no failures. This is averaged across 10,000 simulation runs. Now, in the middle here, you're going to have a lot of failures, okay? So for intermediate diversification, let's say about 3 or 4 counterparties per organization, you're going to have a lot of failures, up to 70% of organizations failing on average, as a consequence of just one idiosyncratic failure, okay? So that's the non-monotonicity in diversification. Here we've held both the threshold for failure and the degree of integration fixed at particular numbers. But as we vary this threshold, we get different curves. So this is, if you have a number like 0.9, that means organizations are more robust. They can survive a bigger loss and still continue operating without incurring the failure cost. So as we vary that number, you see these curves move up and down, but the basic non-monotonicity that we see in them remains, okay? There's an exceptional curve here. When they're very fragile, then increasing diversification no longer helps. But the key thing is this non-monotonicity in diversification, okay? And let me illustrate what's going on here by showing some simple pictures of what these networks look like for various levels of diversification. So Alberto asks a very good question about whether we have any stylized facts about what these numbers are like. That is what diversification and integration mean in the real world, and whether in general we can relate these numbers in the basic model to some empirical reference. That's a great question. One important dimension of that is financial innovation, a lot of people say, basically tends to push both of these up, but perhaps more diversification, right? In the sense that before, in kind of the old economy where you had maybe regional banks, certainly so I'll only speak about the US context because that's the one that I've tried to learn a little bit about. You have these smaller regional banks interacting with large counterparties that connect them to the world system. At some level, that still describes the situation today, but increasingly, as more assets become available, it makes it easier to trade directly in financial markets, to hedge risk directly with counterparties that you may have never had access to before, and that would tend to increase diversification. So I think we're definitely in an increasing diversification world, especially when there are a lot of diverse asset classes available that are attractive to, including to smaller banks or smaller firms that might not have been involved in world financial markets before. And as for integration, that's a trickier one. It relates to individual firms' incentives to hold a large share of their portfolio in other financial assets. So I don't have anything too strong to say about that. But we think that diversification is definitely increasing. And in fact, the speculative thing to say is that in recent crises might have been sort of the recent fragility may have been caused by going from a regime somewhere in here where diversification is pretty low to one where diversification is high, but not quite high enough that everybody sort of doesn't depend too much on their counterparties. And in fact, we're going to see some of those dynamics happening in this illustration. So I've plotted here three typical networks that you see for low levels of diversification, middle levels, and high levels. So the thing that happens is that for low levels of diversification, the network is just not connected enough in this random graph model for any contagion to happen. Anything can happen in these little components, but it's not going to hit a large number of other organizations because there's just no connection to them. For middle ranges of diversification, or actually let me talk about high first. Once diversification gets very high, the network is completely connected, okay? But it's diversified enough that you're pretty well insured against any counterparty failing. You have so many counterparties that one of your counterparties experiencing financial distress is not going to have a huge bite on your portfolio. And it's in the intermediate levels that neither of these good things saves you, right? The network is connected, and so there's this spider that makes wide propagation possible, but the individual relationships are sufficiently big because there are fairly few counterparties per organization, and so that's enough to propagate the contagion at each step. So that's why stuff is pretty bad right in the middle range where the network is connected but not yet diversified enough to have everyone be insured. So now let me pause for a moment and work through some of the questions that have popped up. Great. So Abraham's question in this model for any two organizations that own, say there are two people who own me, they're going to have the same exposure to me in the simple model. That symmetry is imposed. So everybody has a fraction C of them that's owned outside, and it's shared equally among everybody who holds them. Now, of course, in real life, there's a lot of asymmetry, and we turned that off for this simulation. Now let me do one more quick thing on the simulations before we reach sort of a natural stopping point to regroup. So far we've varied diversification. We've changed how many counterparties you have. Now let's vary the intensive margin, how big or deep those relationships are. This picture shows that. So this is the curves we've been looking at before, where integration was set at 1/2. One thing you notice is that as integration goes from low levels, like 0.1, to middle levels, like 0.3, all the way up to 0.5, these curves go up, so there's more failures, basically uniformly. But as we then continue increasing integration to 0.7 and to 0.9, you see that the relationship stops being monotonic. In fact, you now have fewer failures again. And the reason for that is a very integrated economy is going to not be so susceptible because it's a scope for assets to be very fairly divided in some sense. If we are very integrated, what happens is that every counterparty who owns me has big relationships with others that basically pass on that risk, pass on their own portfolio, and make it so that nobody suffers a very big loss in anyone's proprietary assets. So because the economy is so integrated, assets basically flow throughout the whole network. And so if you have a reasonable amount of diversification, everybody's going to be holding something that approximates the market portfolio. And again, you're not going to have big cascades. In essence, increasing integration allows not only to diversify directly with your first order counterparties, but also to end up owning the portfolios of their counterparties and so forth, to lead to that indirect propagation. And that makes it actually safer in the sense that everybody's asset is divided among a larger number of others. And so there's less direct impact of anyone's failure on anyone's value, making the failure threshold harder to hit. So here we've seen another non-monotonicity, that low integration means that there's fairly little exposure to others, and so that there's just not enough. I didn't talk through that, but it's pretty clear that if you're not integrated at all, there's not enough interconnection to lead to a cascade. For high integration, you have the situation where everybody's diversified against the whole market portfolio, and so it's difficult to get even a first failure. And in the middle integration levels, nothing good happens, right? So for 0.5, things are at their worst because the economy is integrated enough to propagate failure, but not so integrated that everybody owns the market portfolio. So let me stop here and address some of the questions. Okay, so Serafine asks the BIS limits on large exposures. I agree that's a good. So in the language we've talked about, it's an interesting example because on the one hand it forces more diversification, right? And the effect on integration is unclear. It's possible that it actually makes it more difficult to be. You certainly have to do more trades to be as integrated as you were before. So that's going to push diversification up, but maybe integration down. And you can see that in order to diagnose the effect, the main takeaway from these pictures is that it's going to depend heavily on where we are along these curves, whether changing diversification or integration is going to be good or bad. That's somehow the main takeaway, that you can't, there's no punchline here like more diversification always leads to more problems. And for complicated regulation of the form that you described, complicated in the sense that it has multiple effects in this model, we're going to have to think very carefully about, where we are so that we can tell which direction it's going to push things. In some sense, so Abraham asks, what's the bottom line? It's true that the bottom line is basically, if we go all the way back to this A matrix, right, what's going to matter in the end is how much failure gets propagated because of the ultimate dependencies in A. And integration and diversification both contribute to the A matrix. So at the end of the day, it's true that what you really care about is A. And all the stuff that I'm talking about is meant to give you intuitions for how various more explicit hands-on changes actually affect the A matrix and affect the ultimate scope for cascades. Now, there's a question whether we have tested yes. So this question about whether real-world networks look like this random graph model that I've shown you, the answer is, in essence, definitely not. Okay. So this illustration you should think of as basically a little back-of-the-envelope calculation that helps us get a grip on some of the basics. But one of the main things we do in the paper, and I hope to have a little time to talk about today, is think about networks with other properties like power law degree distributions, so scale free, and also core periphery structures. Those are hugely important, and there's a lot of literature, especially in sort of networks proper, applied math and stuff like that, which really talks about these features of the financial networks, which are not, in the most vanilla basic random graph models. And we think that those are very important deviations from this model. And so we have a section in the paper devoted to exploring those elaborations. And we also have some stuff on core periphery. So I'm going to try to show you that in the time remaining. Let me flag, so if I understand correctly the interests of this audience, it's probably not the most interesting thing to you to know that there is a formal theorem that captures the non-monotonicities that I just presented. We felt basically, as economic theorists, we felt obligated to show that these were not just things we found in MATLAB from a one-off simulation with particular parameters, but that there is actually a more general random graph model that gets these phenomena analytically. So let me, without getting too much into the details, tell you what our theoretical exercise is, but I won't dwell on the details too much in the interest of getting toward more the applied and computational aspect. So the general theoretical model is that you have a directed network with any distribution you want of in and out degrees, okay? So we've focused in the stuff I showed you, we've focused on a very, very simple homogeneous model where everybody's expected degree is the same. This allows absolutely any degree distribution. There's a suitably defined expected degree in a fully general model, okay, that you can read the formal definition of. And we can define the minimum and maximum degrees. And basically what we do is, given that you have this empirical degree distribution, we're going to take a network uniformly at random, and then basically do the same simulation that I showed you, but now not in a simulation, but you prove theorems about the extent of cascades. And in this more general random graph model, we can show that the qualitative features I emphasized will survive, okay? So basically, if integration is very low or high, there will never be limit contagion. There will never be a positive fraction of organizations failing following an idiosyncratic single asset destruction, okay? But when integration is intermediate, then you will see what we saw in our pictures, that low degree means there is, again, no limit contagion. High degree, so if the minimum degree is bounded below by something, there's no limit contagion. And in the middle, for medium degree, there is limit contagion, okay? So this is true for quite general random graphs, and we were able to prove theorems to that effect, which made us comfortable that we weren't just finding, a very particular thing that depended on the random graph structure that we studied in the simulation that I showed you. Let me show you one more thing about the simulations before we close. I claim to you that the reason integration helps is that it reduces the number of first failures. It basically means that everybody gets to pass on their private holdings to this big financial system, which is very integrated, so that asset gets spread out, and then you don't get first failures. What we demonstrate here is that that's really what's happening in the simulations. So as you increase integration from 0.7 to 0.8 to 0.9, we've plotted here the frequency of first failures, okay? So what we're seeing here is that as the system gets diversified, it basically stops happening that an individual's idiosyncratic failure actually leads, individuals' idiosyncratic asset loss leads to them failing and experiencing their failure cost. It now is just, you don't even have the first failure because these curves are much lower, and so there's no scope for contagion for that reason. So that shows you that the way that integration helps, okay? Very high levels of integration can help. So let me summarize what we've seen in terms of these three ingredients of a cascade that I started out with. You need, in order to get a failure, you need a first failure, and we've seen that integration makes that less likely because it makes you less dependent on your own proprietary assets. Then we've seen that you also need local contagion to happen and these two parameters push in different directions. On the one hand, diversification makes you less exposed to any particular counterparty, and so it decreases the likelihood of local contagion. On the other hand, integration increases how large your exposure is to a given counterparty, and it makes local contagion more likely. And then finally, in terms of wider propagation, diversification is going to increase component size. It's going to take you from here to here, right? And that makes this third ingredient of cascades more dangerous. So because these things are pushing in different directions, that's where the trade-offs come from. That's why we see different, at first this dominates. I'm sorry, I guess I should say first this effect dominates, and then maybe that one dominates, and then maybe this one. Depending on where you are in the parameter space, these forces are going to push in different directions, and that explains the non-monotonicities we saw in the pictures. So we hope that beyond providing the particular random graph results, we can also offer this kind of way of looking at the parts of a cascade so that you can think about how a given policy will affect each of these necessary ingredients of a big cascade, okay? Now in practice, cascades mean bailouts, right? In truth, we don't actually let cascades propagate and become, a disaster that consumes 30% of the economy. But so every time, if you want to think of a world in which a policymaker has a commitment, an implicit commitment to bail out failing organizations that are sufficiently important, the high cascade parts of our world correspond to the parts of the world where the government is going to be on the hook for particularly much money to bail out the failing organizations. Okay, so let me good. So Alberto asks a really important question about if we don't allow discontinuities, what remains? In some sense, it's a very difficult question because the discontinuities are doing all the work in this model. Without discontinuities, there's really no inefficiency, right? So Joe Stiglitz is fond of this point that I think is a very important one, that in traditional financial models without any discontinuities, there's kind of no amplification channel. There's some money. We may not have as much of it as we hope to have. It has to be shared out in some way, but without some kind of at least amplified failure costs, you're kind of, there's not much for policy to do unless it can get money sort of from the sky and make everyone better off. There's really no inefficiency per se, right? In this world, you can save a lot of money with a little injection because you can avoid these discontinuous failures. But in a model without discontinuities, there's really no scope for, you don't really want to stop cascades because there's no inefficiency to begin with. And so that's my first answer, but it is, so I think the discontinuities are essential in this model, but you can work through the loss of value in a model without discontinuities, just given the basic value equation. So I know that's not a very good answer to Alberto's question, but I'm going to think a little more and see if I can say something more useful. What are I'm very sorry for my ignorance. Oscar's question here refers to LA banks. What are LA banks?
Latin America.
I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. So I guess, the low levels of integration. So the point is that the Latin American banks have low levels of regional integration, but they do have diversification with the global economy. It's definitely true that would suggest within the model that they're quite resilient, especially to regional shocks. They should be able to survive them more, at least, than if it were different and they had if they had higher levels of regional diversification. But I guess I should again emphasize that what low or high means in this model will depend a lot on where we are on these curves. So I guess I should, not having taken it certainly to Latin American data, I would be hesitant to say exactly where we are, what low and high diversification means. In these pictures, it means to the left or to the right of the hump, right? But where the hump will depend on very particular parameters of the model. And so I don't want to I think it would be hasty to make claims about where particular economies are, but I do think it could be done with data. And in fact, we sort of try to do a data exercise with Europe that I'll show you. Now let me quickly talk through an example with a more realistic network structure that relates to interbank networks. And so I'll quickly outline this, and this is actually relevant to Abraham's latest question. So here's a structure that we got from Soramaki and others, which describes which gives us a stylized and pretty clear picture of what interbank network looks like in the United States. So these are Fedwire interbank payments, and you can see that this network has a very particular structure. It has a very tightly connected cluster of large banks. You see these include the very largest, okay? And then it has smaller peripheral banks that in aggregate account for a serious amount of money, but tend to be connected to just a few of the central core banks, okay? And so this network is rather different from the ones we've studied in the basic simulations. And so I wanted to just at least flag. Now, there's a good point that the Fedwire payments network is at best a proxy for real exposures, especially because a lot of these payments and exposures are overnight. And so, I'm sorry, a lot of the payments that this represents are overnight debt. And so, are these banks really exposed to each other? We think that's a serious question. And so even though there's now quite a few papers taking this network seriously, I agree with you that that's a pretty big jump, and we need to understand much more about exposures. And I'm glad that there's work on that now that's trying to understand that difference. But let's take for a moment as a stylized model a world in which it does look like this. And then I just want to flag that we basically created a random graph model to capture a core periphery structure. So if you ever have an empirical situation in which core periphery is relevant, we show how you can use our model to simulate that. You have some core organizations, some peripheral ones. We connect the peripheral ones at random to one core organization, and then we allow the core organizations to be connected to all the others. The core organizations are much bigger. In our simulation, they're 8 times bigger. And then you can vary independently the integration within the core component, so the magnitude of cross-holdings within the core, and then the strength of the relationships between the core and periphery. And some of the basic aspects of our picture survive. Okay, so here what we've done is we've varied how integrated the core is, and we see that there's the same kind of non-monotonicity that we observed in previous results. That when the core is not very integrated, so when the global financial system is not very integrated, then you have a low level of cascades. this is following the failure of one peripheral organization idiosyncratically. Okay, so when the core is not very integrated, you have low levels of cascades. Then they increase, they become much higher, and then finally, when the integration is high enough that the first failure is very well shared out in the economy, once again you get to low levels of cascades. So, but other aspects of this core periphery structure end up behaving quite differently, actually. And so if you're interested in structures like that, I encourage you to look at the simulations in the paper, which explore what goes on in much more detail. So let me now stop and look at some of the questions again. Okay, so how would we define systemically important in this model? We think actually that one of the main virtues of this model is that it reduces an extremely complicated system given by all the cross-holdings to a simple matrix that kind of captures everything that's going on in terms of people's actual direct and indirect exposures. So let me go back here to the A matrix. So this matrix A, which converts cross-holdings into ultimate dependencies, can be used to tell you how much a given organization ultimately, how its value ultimately accrues to others. Okay, so this is reminiscent of Leontief economies, but it also is reminiscent of network centrality results, which try to use linear systems like this to think about which institutions are particularly important. And so I would say that a systemically important institution is one that has, first of all, a large value in the sense that, so VI is large, so presumably its failure costs conditional on having to liquidate would also be large, although there are some caveats there. And moreover, it has, in this A matrix, many other organizations whose VIs are large also depend on it, right? So that if those guys were to fail, it would lead to a lot of other potentially big failures. So that's not a complete answer, but I guess I want to say at a high level that in order to diagnose systemic importance, you should look at the A matrix and then ask, systemically important means that your failure would lead to that your idiosyncratic failure would lead to a large number of downstream effects, which I sort of outlined some of the ingredients for that just now. But you can see how you would use that framework to be able to run a simulation, drop one organization down to its failure threshold and see how big the effect is. If the effect is big, it's going to be systemically important, and that comes down to this A matrix, as well as these failure costs that are captured by the betas. So let me now look back at questions. Yeah, so it's a good point and an important one that we should not use interbank payments as good proxies for exposure. We use them here, honestly, for lack of anything better, because I don't think we certainly weren't aware of your work, Serafine, at the time that we were looking for data on that. But I think there's in the network, especially in the financial networks literature, it's now becoming really a key question what the interbank exposures are. And I think it's critical to use data that you guys have to understand what interbank exposures are and whether there are structures in the world that look like core periphery. So let me now, let me make the last thing I say a discussion of the illustrative application that we have with European data, and this part is in some sense what we are least. We don't want this to be taken seriously in terms of the numbers, okay? Because what we did is we pulled Bank of International Settlements numbers that we know are not, don't capture all relevant exposures are very aggregated. And so we just wanted to discipline ourselves to put some numbers in the system, but we're aware that central banks that have detailed data on interbank exposures will be able to do a much better job of getting the C matrix and the A matrix than we were able to do. So we just want to say how we would do it with ad hoc assumptions and imprecise numbers, and then we hope that other people can use these kinds of simulations with much better data. Okay, so with that caveat out of the way, let me say what we did. We took 6 key countries in Europe that were much discussed during the recent crisis, and we treated them as a closed system just for an illustrative exercise. And we decided to see what happens if values fall due to a contraction, and then debt is devalued. You know, what will be the results in terms of cascades according to our model? So we took this BIS data on, these are exposures on an immediate borrower basis, okay? So, for example, this entry tells you that France, so the column is who owes the money. France owes 174 billion to Germany on an immediate borrower basis. And Germany here means all institutions operating in Germany. So German banks, German funds of all sorts that the BIS was able to track. So they aggregated up those numbers, and this gives us sort of the direct exposures. Now, of course, if people stop paying their debts, that's going to propagate and have indirect effects. So what we do is we take this matrix and compute from it the A matrix of ultimate exposures. So how much countries are ultimately exposed to the losses or failures in other countries. And the better way to look at this is graphically. So this means this picture shows where the money flows, or in the case of some countries does not flow. So Greece, you know, this means that of Greece's fiscal stream, 12% ultimately flows to Germany and 13% ultimately flows to France, and the rest is retained by domestic creditors. So let me say here that there was a critical assumption in converting C matrix to A matrix, namely the fraction of debt that's held externally versus internally. There are not good numbers on that. Reinhardt and Rogoff have a paper in which they do their best to estimate it, and the answer is that it's, you know, as a very rough back of the envelope estimate, we can say that about 1/3 is held externally for these European countries, but that's very imprecise, and that's one of the main ways in which we need much better data to be able to estimate actual international exposures. So now the simulation exercise we did, given these exposures, is we said, okay, so, you know, take the failure threshold to be contracting enough relative to your 2008 GDP. So 2008 was good times, okay? After that, there was a big slide in GDP, and we consider a country to be in danger of default on its obligations if its GDP contracts by a sufficient fraction, okay? So that's what the failure thresholds are, and theta will be varied at within the simulations. And then we're going to look at the fiscal streams coming from 2011 output as being the proprietary assets that generate the value in the economy, okay? So given those fiscal streams, we're going to calculate the values of all organizations in 2011, taking into account the direct and indirect flow of value. And then we're going to calculate cascades in the best case equilibrium, okay? So once again, assuming as little failure as is consistent. So the other key assumption in the structure is that the failure costs will be set to half of the failure threshold, which basically means that when you when you default on your obligations, the value of your debt falls by a factor of half to your direct counterparties. Okay, that's inspired by the Greek example, in which after the renegotiation, counterparties took about a half. They ended up getting only the half of the face value of their debt. But it's, obviously more realistic numbers would be important here. And I should say that we're working here in GDP scale. So we're actually not working at the scale of debts, but we just scale everything up to be at the scale of GDP. That doesn't make a difference, but I thought I should flag it. So these are the GDPs before and after the crisis, and these are the percentage drops that various countries experienced. And so what we're going to be doing in the simulation exercise is seeing how those drops are going to propagate through the system once we take into account all the direct and indirect exposures. Yeah, so there's a question that's, is there a way to account for countries, how likely individual countries are to actually serve as conduits of failure? In our model, this is captured purely by the bankruptcy threshold, or the failure threshold and the failure costs. So you might think that a country that's very stable and that has a lot of resources to draw on to buffet shocks will basically just have a failure threshold that will be much lower. It will need to lose much more value before it actually undertakes, inefficient actions, at least statically inefficient, like losing real value. So you might think that Germany would be, even if Germany's fiscal stream got quite bad, it has sufficiently sound mechanisms inside that it would be able to do something, whether it's political changes or borrowing against its own future tax receipts, something that would make it less likely to actually serve as a conduit of this distress. And that would, in our model, correspond to having a threshold that's much lower, much safer than, say, Greece, for actually incurring the discontinuities. Now, that model is quite simple and stylized, and we could get much more realistic in having probabilistic aspects, right? Maybe failure is not for sure, but it happens with some probability when you hit your failure threshold. And you might think that safer countries have a lower probability of actually reaching the distress state, even conditional on being in danger. And so those are elaborations that we've thought some about, but that would certainly be worth exploring to incorporate this notion of likelihood of contagion. Within the model as we have it, we're going to look at how these drops. So look, so Greece is definitely going to fail, right? I mean, under any reasonable thresholds, all our thresholds are with it, around. Once you lose 10%, you're going to have in our world, you're going to have this drop. And so in all our simulations, even when the threshold is 0.9, so you survive as long as you're worth 90% of what you were in 2008, Greece is still going to fail. But Greece is the only one that fails in these data, because basically for these thresholds, because it's not big enough for its failure to take a big enough bite out of other fragile countries. So if theta is 90 or 93%, if that's the threshold above which you're safe, then only Greece is a failure and everybody else survives. As soon as we push the threshold to 0.935, so that you experience a failure cost as soon as you lose 6.5% of your value, we get a real cascade going, right? So what happens is that Greece fails, then Portugal fails, not because it's very exposed to Greece, but it's very close to its own threshold. So even the small indirect exposure that it has to Greece through Europe is enough to push it over the edge. Then Spain is also not doing so well, and it's exposed to Portugal, so it fails. And yes, one of the amusing things about these simulations is that Italy, it seems pretty robustly, is in the last wave of Cascades, even though it's not so. It's fairly. It lost a substantial amount of value even though not as much as others, but it's just not very exposed to the European debt markets, according to the BIS data. And so it's not going to be a first-order victim of these financial contagions. Germany is much more exposed. So even though it's strong, it ends up failing earlier than Italy. So once again, these exercises are super loose and reliant on numbers that we got from public sources. They're not the best numbers, but we wanted to do this to discipline ourselves to use real numbers, and also so that we could see whether with not letting ourselves tune 10 different parameters, just varying the parameter theta, whether we could get outcomes that look somewhat reasonable, somewhat true to life in terms of what analysts were discussing at the time. And we're pretty satisfied with the exercise in that sense, but we view it as basically a proof of concept and an encouragement for empirical researchers to look at cascades in models of this type and analyze their structure. One last comment, and this will be the last thing I say before I conclude. This model is static, right? All the value gets realized once, and then the cascades are purely these first, second failures are something that happens in our algorithm. And so you might ask, why are you talking about this in a dynamic way? A key point in this table is that if you can bail out a given level, like say you can bail out the second level here, save Portugal in this cascade, then nobody after them will fail, okay? Because the third failure is a direct consequence of the second failures. It wouldn't have happened without Portugal and Greece's failure, right? So if at any point you can bail out everyone above that level, then nothing further will happen. No further discontinuities will be sustained. And you don't actually always have to bail out everyone above you. It may suffice only to bail out Portugal. So these, even though the model is static, and we think dynamic extensions would be very important, this does show us that that you can infer the causal structure of cascades from this first, second, third wave formalism we've introduced with the algorithm. That's basically all I had, and I just want to, hopefully we'll have so theta is a threshold for everyone. So we consider a country to fail if it contracts at least theta relative to its 2008 GDP. And so if the total value of its assets that it owns directly and indirectly. And so that's the model. And that's not realistic. The thetas should be different for different countries, but we did it to tie our hands so that we couldn't fine-tune the model to produce whatever result we wanted. But of course, empirical estimates of theta are important and difficult to obtain. So that's basically all I wanted to say. That this Leontief model is simple but fairly flexible and can incorporate a lot of effects. You can use it to think about integration and diversification, and you can use it as foundations for studying counterfactuals, including bailouts, both by the government and by organizations with each other, and also for studying network formation. And so I guess we have officially 90 minutes, so I'll stop here, and if there are questions in the remaining 5 minutes, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. So if you have further questions, you can write down as we have been doing it, or you can raise your hand. And Benjamin, I understand that the paper is forthcoming in the American Economic Review, but you also have a working paper version that we share and is available through the SSRN. So you can I guess look at both versions. Is the version that is going to be published very different from this one, Ben?
No. So in terms of the version that's up on the internet now is basically is very, very similar to the published one, except we discovered actually quite a few typos we were just doing the final corrections this weekend. So if you're gonna, for those who are interested in the theory in detail or the empirics, I would encourage you to wait it should be about 2 or 3 weeks before we can put the final version on our website. and that has a lot of typos corrected, so it might save you some pain. But at a high level, the paper that Alberto just sent a link to is basically the final version in substance. So the all the main theorems and all the main analysis is the same. So Abraham asks, should Germany or EU have bailed out Greece? One thing that the simulations show is that if these were the relevant thresholds, right, if we weren't so worried about Portugal crossing the brink, then actually, one failure may have been, it certainly doesn't have the externalities are not so big in this case because there's only one failure. And so we found it reassuring in this model that there was a regime in which Greece failed, which it more or less did, right? I mean, it had this big write-down, and it gave its creditors much less than they were owed, and that didn't lead to a widespread disaster. So it's possible that the reason that the bailout didn't happen is because the policymakers in Europe were aware of this, that Greece was not on its own big enough to precipitate a big domino effect, although there were times when that was definitely not clear. Okay.
Ben, well, people write down. I understand that Matthew Jackson runs a Coursera course on these topics. So I'm going to share the link to his webpage in case people wanna sign up. The course will start September 21st, and as I understand, it is a Coursera course, so it is free and open to anyone interested in these topics. So as you could see, there are many people who are experts on this, Serafin, Green, and others, but many of us are newbies to it, so we might benefit from taking Matthew's course to learn a little bit about networks.
Yeah, Matt's course is really very. It starts simple, and he's great at explaining especially some of the random graph ideas, which end up being important for building intuition. He has very nice economic examples, and so I've watched some of those lectures, and they both get into serious economics, but they don't assume much knowledge of the network formalism. And so I think for us, it's a great resource for the networks community because we can now, some of the stuff is pretty technical, and he's great at getting you up to speed. So if I can just also put in a plug for that course. So I guess we're out of time. I want to say I really enjoyed the interaction, and I was a little nervous about the format, but it's great to be able to take questions live and to be able to communicate with much more people than we could ever get in one room. So I'm very grateful to you guys for running this.
Oh, thank you very much. So just as a reminder, next week we'll have Nick Bloom from Stanford, who will talk about measuring economic policy uncertainty. And the week after, we will change our session from Tuesday to Wednesday because many countries in Central America and Mexico will be on a holiday on Tuesday. And we'll have Enrique Mendoza, who will be talking about from credit booms to credit crisis. So you can always go to the research website where you will see the papers that are going to be presented and the schedule of the presentations. Thank you very much to everyone, and especially thanks to our speaker today, Benjamin Golub.